Hi, in this video we're going to talk about budgets. It is often thought that budget is something to be afraid of since it is complicated and usually really difficult to understand. But in reality, a budget is the most important helper in planning your financial resources, especially when there are not that many of them. Budgets are nowadays used everywhere, in ruling countries and businesses, in event management, or even in daily life if you want to plan where your money comes and goes. Budgets are extremely necessary if you want to keep an eye on the money flows of an event that you're organizing to avoid overspending. Budgets ensure confident and visible usage of money, and those do show when it is getting critical regarding the resources that you have. Furthermore, budget helps to make different decisions, especially the ones regarding expenses, of course. Budgets can be regarded as the reflection of all the decisions that are made in the team that is organizing the event. It doesn't matter if the decision is reflected from the expense or the income side. It is still there. Before diving deeper into that, I have to break a myth that is widespread. They say that budget is only for finance people and that they have to keep an eye on it. Wrong, very wrong. Budget is meant for everybody who is involved with the expenses reflected in the budget, meaning that every team member who is involved in the activities needs to understand how his or her area of the responsibility is connected to the budget itself. For example, the one who is doing promotion, you think that maybe this person doesn't need to know anything about the budget. But actually he does. He needs to know how many people are needed to be attracted to keep the budget in surplus. The person responsible for logistics, for example, needs to know what is the maximum amount that can be spent on the venue, transportation, and so on. Whatever you can imagine. Everybody who is involved with the budget must simply understand it in order to know how to use the resources and how different sources of income and expenses affect each other. In order to put the budget together, it is necessary to think through several aspects. First of all, which kind of event are you organizing? How large the event will be? Because depending on the scale, the budget can be very, very different. The level of detail and how complex it is. It must be chosen. The budget itself must be as simple as possible, but at the same time as detailed as necessary. Secondly, who will start to use the budget and how good is their knowledge in the field? As we talked before, budget is a tool and a good one, and it must be understandable for everyone who is using it. Thirdly, do you know whether similar events that you're organizing at the moment, whether those have been organized in your organization before? If so, it is pretty good to use old examples and adapt those to fit the current events. Using old budget as an example makes it easier to mark down probable expenses or the structure of the budget. At the same time, please note that there is a threat that the old budget is followed too strictly. Please keep in mind and remember that it's important, really important, to keep improving the current budget during the organizing period. Fourthly, if similar event hasn't been organized previously, you can search, for example, from the internet. Use the budget form from Excel or start putting the budget together from scratch from your own logic. I'm sure you have one. Again, when using templates of other budgets, it's important to adapt those to fit the needs of the event and make sure that everyone understands. It is always recommended to add additional elements if you see that you need to, and if the budget gets more reasonable by those. If you're compiling the budget from scratch by yourself, then we would advise to consider the following aspects. Firstly, decide on the overall structure of income and expenses. For example, you can take one sheet for the revenue, another for the expenses, and third for showing the results. If we're talking about Excel sheets or Google spreadsheet, for example. This structure helps to go around in the file pretty quickly. Now, when looking at the cost sheet, it is important to bring out what is the planned amount, but also what is the realized, meaning the actual amount. As the name says, planned is showing the amount that you think can be spent. Please note to take into account the real prices and be a bit more pessimistic on those. Meaning that if milk costs 69 cents, for example, in the shop, take into account at least 70 or even 80 cents. Plan the budget so that you think everything is more expensive than the things actually are. This enables you to have a buffer that will be needed for sure as things come up that you couldn't predict before. Realized amounts will be filled in after the event itself, when you know how much you actually spent. Later you can analyze the differences between the planned and the actual sums. Also, we advise you to add the general sum of expenses and overall sums of different areas. It helps you later on if you need to find some money from somewhere or have to cut the costs. When we're looking at the revenue sheet, in overall, the structure should be the same to understand it quickly. What is planned and what is the actual or realized amount. The usual revenues for the event come from ticket sales, different funds and partners, or from selling items on spot. We advise you to add another table there when talking about the ticket sales, where you can mark down how many people are expected and how many will actually come. By this you can add an equation that multiplies the number of people with the ticket price, and voila, you can see easily how many people you need to be in surplus with the budget. The same logic applies when putting down the amounts and prices of items that you're planning to sell. When marking down the funds, the easiest way is simply mark down the name of the fund and what is the sum that you're applying to, what are you planning to get. Later on, the realized or actual will be the amount that you're actually receiving from the fund. A great tip is to add graphical versions of your planned sums to both the expenses and the revenue part of your Excel or Google spreadsheet. People will grasp info way quicker from the charts. The third sheet is the one that draws all the conclusions, meaning sums up the expenses and revenues and gives you the actual outcome, whether you are in loss or in surplus. It should also be planned and realized numbers both there. When the structure of the budget is set and you have an event that has a participation fee, you shouldn't take the fee from air, just that, oh, I think that this could be this. To find the fee that is good enough to cover the expenses, you have to sum up all the planned expenses and divide the final amount with a pessimistic number of planned people. Then you'll know how much each participant has to pay so that you could cover everything that you're going to expend on. I'm saying pessimistic number of people so that you would take into account a smaller number of people than would actually come. This again gives some buffer money for later usage. Dividing all the costs with the number of people is a possibility when you don't have any other income sources. But if you do, feel free not to take those into account when those are small, for example item sales, because not taking into account some income gives you a bit more buffer zone. But of course, if we're talking about bigger sums that you applied for funds, for example, for sure you have to take those into account, as otherwise the ticket price goes insanely high. By doing everything we just talked about, you have an initial budget set, and the criteria for a successful event, as with some of them, are fulfilled by that. Now let's talk about the 10 commandments of a budget. 1. Check whether someone has done a similar event in your organization. And if yes, then use the knowledge and information to make a realistic budget. If no one has ever done something like that, there are other organizations to turn to, or just Googling, it also helps. 2. Set the prognosed number of people you're expecting to the event. This is a critical part of your budget. A rule is that you should never take into account the bigger number of participants than you had last time, if there actually was an event before. Either way, put a bit more pessimistic number of people. 3. Set the changing expenses, meaning the ones that are dependent on the number of participants, food, name tags, and so on. 4. Set the fixed expenses, meaning the ones that don't depend on the number of participants. For example, microphones or stage or something like that. 5. Search for hidden expenses. Please don't forget to take into account different taxes, labor costs, damage fees, and so on. 6. Predict the income from the funds, sponsors, and advertising. Put the numbers lower than you think those actually could be. Again, this is building the buffer zone for you later on. 7. Never ever plan a budget to be in a loss. If you see that you're slowly getting closer to a minus, start cutting costs or looking for the new ways to get some revenue. 8. When putting down the expenses, use actual prices from the shops, markets, and so on. And again, be a bit more pessimistic and mark down the prices a little bit higher than those actually are. 9. Check the budget several times. If you have to cut some costs, think through what are more nice to have and what are the must-haves. Never ever cut the costs of the must-haves. And 10. Be critical towards ideas that take a lot of money. Now, when the budget is ready, the job just begins. You have to keep an eye on every change that you have in the events plan and ask from yourself whether it changes anything in the budget. The one who manages the budget is the one who tells whether you can afford something or not. If you don't have any money, then how will you pay for a cool idea, even though it's cool? It is probable that you have to cut some costs from one area to find money for another, more important one. You have to keep an eye on the budget all the time. Only then you can ensure that you stay in the limits you have set for yourself and that you're not overspending. We do advise you to make a copy of the initial budget and then start updating one of the versions with costs and revenues. Another one just to keep, just in case you need to turn to the very first plan you had. When the event itself is over and you know exactly how much to spend, it is time to start analyzing the budget. Hopefully you know all the expenses and all the revenues and also have filled in the realized part already on the way. Also, hopefully you have all the checks that prove how much spent on something. Different revenue sources, for example funds, for sure. They might start asking for those. And when everything is filled, analyze what was more or what was less expensive. How did you manage with the money flows and what could you do differently to finish another event even better? Your budget is a great source of learning when you are organizing a similar event some other time. And now let's talk about the funds. Very briefly but still, and briefly because you have to read the exact guidelines of the fund you're applying to. All of them are different from each other, but gladly there are still some general aspects to keep in mind. Firstly, please align your application with the aims of the fund, meaning that if you have a fund that is giving out money for different sport events, then please don't go there with your application for a cultural event. You will simply waste your time and theirs. Secondly, present the costs in an understandable way, so that it would be easy even for a child to understand what are your expenses. And thirdly, ask for feedback about the application. You can use different consultancy companies, people with more experience in project management, or even the fund itself. If you're doubtful whether you will get the money or not, then try to apply at least one round before your very last chance. That way, if you get rejected in the first round, you can ask for feedback and then apply again. This can work for you. And lastly, some organizations that are supporting different youth activities are, for example, H&M, Hasartmängumaksu Nõukogu in Estonian, different city governments, or even university funds. In short, this is the general knowledge about budgeting and applying to funds. I hope it all goes well and that you stay in surplus.